I had always considered myself a peaceful person, someone who valued the serenity of my home, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. But that all changed one Monday morning when I received a letter that would completely upend my life. It wasn't just any letter, but one that made my blood run cold. The HOA had sold my house without my knowledge. My mind raced as I stood there, staring at the notice with disbelief. How could this have happened? I had never once been informed about this, let alone given consent. The paperwork they'd sent along with the notice was riddled with mistakes, but there it was, a signed contract listing my home as property to be sold. It was as if my entire life had been turned upside down in an instant. I paced back and forth in my living room, trying to process what I had just read. The sheer audacity of the HOA, selling a house that didn't belong to them, felt like something straight out of a bad movie. But this was real. My phone buzzed incessantly on the coffee table, but I ignored it. Nothing could explain what was happening, and I couldn't focus on anything else. It didn't take long before I found myself standing in front of the HOA office. The building, a dull beige structure that had always looked like it was just waiting to collapse, now seemed menacing. I took a deep breath and walked in, ready to get some answers. Inside, the smell of stale coffee and stale paperwork filled the air. The receptionist, a woman I had seen before but never really paid attention to, glanced up at me. "Can I help you?" she asked, not even bothering to hide the lack of interest in her voice. I showed her the letter, my hands shaking slightly. Her eyes widened when she saw what I was holding. I don't know what to say," she stammered. This can't be right." Of course, it couldn't be right. I was staring at the biggest mistake anyone could make. The problem wasn't just the sale. It was that they'd done it without telling me, without even consulting me. I knew I wasn't some ordinary resident in this neighborhood. I was the commissioner of police, and I had worked hard for every bit of respect I had earned. But that didn't seem to matter to the people at the HOA. All that mattered to them was power, control, and a sense of entitlement. I demanded to see the person responsible. A few minutes later, the head of the HOA, Mr. Jordan, a man who thought he was above the law, stepped into the room. He was smug, his suit perfectly pressed, his smile too wide. "Ah, Commissioner," he said, with a tone that made me want to slap him across the face. "I see you've received our little notice. There's nothing to worry about. The sale is all official. Your house is already in escrow. We've done everything by the book." He seemed too relaxed, as if he were unaware that the person he was speaking to had the power to make his life a living hell. I clenched my fists at my sides. "You sold my house, Jordan," I said, my voice low but steady. "Without my consent, without informing me, and without the proper legal process. This isn't just a mistake, this is fraud." His smile faltered for a second, but he quickly recovered. "Look, Commissioner, it's just a simple misunderstanding. You signed the agreement, didn't you?" He waved his hand as if I had somehow forgotten about it. I had never signed anything. I would never have signed away my home. I leaned in, making sure he understood the weight of the words I was about to say. "If you think for 1 second that you can get away with this, you're mistaken. I'll make sure every single person involved in this mess is held accountable. You've messed with the wrong person." His face turned a shade paler, but he didn't respond. I could see it in his eyes, the realization dawning on him that this wasn't going to be a simple issue to sweep under the rug. I left the office, my mind already racing with the steps I would take next. This wasn't just about a house. This was about principle. The HOA had crossed a line, and now they would have to pay the price. But I wasn't going to stop there. I would use every ounce of my power as commissioner to expose this corruption, and I would make sure the community knew what had happened. The first thing I did when I got home was call my lawyer. I needed someone who understood the law, someone who could handle the legal side of things while I took care of the rest. As I waited for him to pick up, I glanced out the window at my beautiful home, wondering how it had all come to this. But one thing was for sure, I wasn't going to let the HOA get away with this. They had no idea who they were messing with. I immediately began gathering evidence to support my case. I started with the letter from the HOA, scanning every word and analyzing the paperwork they had sent. It was riddled with inaccuracies and lacked the proper signatures and approvals. There was no way they had the legal right to do what they had done, and I knew I needed to act quickly before the sale was finalized. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. The HOA had overstepped their boundaries in a way I never imagined possible. As the commissioner of police, I had dealt with countless cases of corruption and misconduct, but never did I expect to find myself in a situation like this. This wasn't just a matter of someone making a mistake. It was a deliberate act to bypass the law and take advantage of their position. I spent hours combing through the legal documents, looking for anything that could help me build a strong case against the HOA. My lawyer called shortly after, and I explained the situation. He was just as shocked as I was, but reassured me that we had a solid case. The first thing we needed to do was file a formal complaint and put a stop to the sale before it was too late. As we worked on the legal details, I started thinking about the bigger picture. This wasn't just about my house. It was about all the other homeowners in the neighborhood who were at the mercy of the HOA. If they could get away with this, who knew what other illegal actions they might be committing? The next day, I decided to confront Mr. Jordan once again. This time, I wasn't going to hold back. I knew I had the law on my side, and I wasn't afraid to use it. When I walked into the HOA office, the receptionist looked up at me, her face pale. She must have realized by now that this wasn't going to be a simple issue to resolve. Mr. Jordan was sitting behind his desk, and when he saw me walk in, his smug smile faltered. "Commissioner," he said, trying to sound casual, but I could see the nervousness in his eyes. I handed him the papers I had gathered, showing all the legal discrepancies in the sale documents. He tried to brush it off, but I wasn't having it. I told him in no uncertain terms that I would be taking legal action and that I would not rest until the HOA was held accountable for their actions. He attempted to play it off as a mistake, but I wasn't fooled. I had worked in law enforcement long enough to recognize when someone was lying, and Mr. Jordan was lying through his teeth. It was clear that they had intentionally violated the law, and I was determined to make sure they paid for it. I walked out of the office with a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about getting my house back. It was about holding the HOA accountable for their illegal actions and ensuring that they couldn't continue to bully other homeowners. I immediately reached out to the press. If the HOA thought they could get away with this quietly, they were mistaken. I had a plan to expose them for what they truly were, a corrupt organization that exploited homeowners for their own gain. I worked with a local reporter, providing them with all the evidence I had gathered. Within hours, the story was making headlines. The HOA tried to spin the situation, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, but the public wasn't buying it. People in the neighborhood started to speak out, sharing their own stories of how the HOA had tried to control every aspect of their lives. The more the story spread, the more people realized just how far the HOA was willing to go to maintain their grip on power. As the media coverage grew, I made sure to keep up the pressure. I contacted the state attorney general's office and began working with them to investigate the HOA's actions. The more I dug into their practices, the more I uncovered. It wasn't just the sale of my house. The HOA had been involved in numerous illegal activities for years, and I was going to make sure they were held accountable. The community was beginning to rally behind me, and it felt like the momentum was on our side. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak up were now coming forward, sharing their own experiences with the HOA's overreach. Then came the turning point. One evening, as I was sitting at home reviewing more documents, I received a call from the mayor. He had heard about what was happening and wanted to offer his support. He told me that the HOA's actions had been under scrutiny for some time, and he was more than willing to help expose their corruption. It felt like the tide was finally turning in our favor. With the mayor on our side, I knew we had the backing we needed to bring the full weight of the law down on the HOA. I was no longer just a commissioner of police. I was a force to be reckoned with. The HOA had underestimated me, and now they were going to learn the hard way that you don't mess with someone who knows how to use the law to their advantage. The following week, I held a press conference in front of my house, determined to make sure the HOA's illegal actions were brought to light once and for all. I stood there, facing the cameras, as the neighborhood gathered behind me. With the press and a growing crowd of supporters, I announced that I would be filing a lawsuit against the HOA for fraud, negligence, and violations of homeowners' rights. The story went viral, and soon, the HOA was on the defensive. They tried to dismiss the claims, but the evidence was overwhelming. The community had rallied around me, and there was no turning back. As the legal battle raged on, I knew the fight wasn't just for my home. It was for every homeowner who had ever felt powerless against the HOA. The more I exposed, the more I realized how deep the corruption ran. This wasn't just about one house. It was about an entire system that had been abusing its power for years. I wasn't going to let that go unchecked. The battle was just beginning, and I was ready to fight until the very end. The legal battle against the HOA was far from easy. As the days passed, I found myself buried under mountains of paperwork, legal jargon, and endless meetings. But with every new discovery, my resolve only strengthened. It wasn't just about reclaiming my home anymore. It was about dismantling the entire corrupt system the HOA had built over the years. The more I dug, the more I realized the extent of their malpractices. The sale of my house was just the tip of the iceberg. They had been skimming off fees from residents, creating false violations, and pressuring homeowners into paying unnecessary fines for years. I couldn't allow them to get away with it. This wasn't just about me. It was about every single person in the neighborhood who had been affected by their greed. The neighborhood's support grew stronger with every passing day. Neighbors who had once been too intimidated to speak up now found the courage to come forward. People began sharing their stories of how the HOA had bullied them into making repairs they couldn't afford or fine them for things that were completely unreasonable. It wasn't just the sale of my house that had enraged them. It was the fact that the HOA had overstepped their bounds for far too long, taking advantage of people who didn't know how to fight back. The community was waking up, and they were ready to stand with me. I knew it wouldn't be long before the pressure became too much for the HOA to handle. It wasn't just the press or the neighbors anymore. As I continued to gather evidence, I contacted various watchdog groups that focused on housing rights and fair practices. They were horrified by the corruption I was uncovering and immediately offered their support. The more I exposed, the more the HOA tried to cover up their tracks. They hired expensive lawyers, made false statements, and even tried to silence anyone who spoke out against them. But every time they tried to push back, the truth seemed to come out even louder. Then, the unexpected happened. One of the HOA's board members, a man named Mr. Lawson, reached out to me privately. He was disillusioned with the way things were being run and admitted that he had been coerced into signing off on decisions that he knew were wrong. He had seen the corruption from the inside, and he wanted to make things right. Mr. Lawson gave me a wealth of information about the HOA's illegal activities, including documents that proved they had been skimming off the top of fines for years. With this new evidence in hand, I knew I had enough to take the HOA down once and for all. I met with my lawyer the following day, and we strategized on how to bring everything to light. The case had grown from a simple dispute about my house to a full-blown investigation into the HOA's entire operation. We filed additional charges, including conspiracy, fraud, and a series of violations that would expose the organization for what it truly was: a corrupt, power-hungry entity that had been exploiting the very people it was supposed to protect. The moment the news hit the public, the HOA's credibility crumbled. The once untouchable board members found themselves facing an overwhelming tide of public outrage, legal action, and media scrutiny. I knew that the battle wasn't over yet. The HOA would continue to fight back, but with the evidence we had gathered and the support of the community, I felt more confident than ever that justice would prevail. It wasn't just about winning the case, it was about creating lasting change. The people in my neighborhood had suffered under the HOA's rule for far too long, and now it was time for them to be heard. As the legal proceedings dragged on, I received a surprising call from the local news station. They wanted to do an exclusive interview with me about the case and the role the community had played in standing up to the HOA. I agreed, knowing that this was yet another opportunity to shed light on the issue and keep the pressure on. The interview aired that evening, and it went viral. People from all over the state reached out to share their own experiences with corrupt HOAs, and it became clear that my fight was not an isolated incident. This was happening everywhere, and something needed to be done to stop it. Soon after the interview aired, more neighbors came forward with their own stories. One by one, they spoke out about how the HOA had threatened them, fined them, and made their lives miserable. The support from the community grew stronger, and I knew that the tide was turning. It wasn't just my fight anymore. It was a fight for every homeowner who had ever been taken advantage of by an HOA. The more people shared their stories, the more pressure mounted on the HOA. They had no choice but to fold. In the weeks that followed, the HOA's power began to unravel. Their legal team quit, one board member after another resigned, and the public turned against them. It was clear that they had lost all credibility. The once feared HOA had been reduced to nothing more than a hollow shell of what it had once been. But the victory wasn't just mine, it belonged to the entire neighborhood. For the first time in years, people felt like they had a voice. They realized that standing up to injustice was possible, and that together, they could make a difference. With the HOA in ruins, I decided it was time to rebuild. Not just my house, but the trust that had been shattered by their actions. I worked with the community to create a new system, one that was fair and transparent, where homeowners would have a say in the decisions that affected their lives. We formed a new neighborhood association, one that prioritized the needs of its residents over power and control. The changes weren't just legal, they were cultural. People began to take pride in their community, knowing that they no longer had to live in fear of arbitrary fines and unjust rules. The final blow came when the HOA's remaining assets were liquidated, and the proceeds were used to fund a community center that would help residents with housing, legal advice, and other essential services. The building that once housed the HOA's offices was repurposed as a safe space for residents, where they could gather, share resources, and work together to make their neighborhood a better place. It was a fitting end to the reign of a corrupt organization that had made so many lives miserable. Looking back, I realized how much this fight had changed not only my life, but the lives of everyone in the neighborhood. The experience had taught me the importance of standing up for what's right, no matter how difficult the battle may seem. The neighborhood that once felt like a place of fear and division had transformed into a community of support, strength, and unity. And for the first time in a long while, I could look out the window of my house and feel a sense of peace. The battle was over, but the victory had.